Hello everybody. My name is Karl-Heinz Bosch. I wrote this project together with my colleague Robert Pressel, and one part of it was the webinars. We had a whole series of webinars, and this is the last webinar that we're doing within the Prosperity Project. Maybe we continue in other projects or on the LTIS platform, we don't know yet. Today, the theme is monitoring and evaluation, and the speaker is Tom Rye, Professor Tom Rye from Napier University in Edinburgh. Currently, he really is in Edinburgh. He's traveling a lot, but yeah, or at least in Britain, that's what he said.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Brexit, Britain.
I think you can take over now, Tom. And
okay.
For an explanation, so if you have any questions, please use the chat, and I will collect these chat questions and ask them. You can ask any questions anytime you want.
Okay.
Okay, Tom.
Thank you very much, Karl-Heinz, and welcome everybody to this webinar, which is about, well, targets, indicators, monitoring and evaluation in SUMPs, but all in less than an hour. So we'll see how it goes. There's quite a lot to fit in, but essentially, I'm going to talk about these things. So the role of monitoring and evaluation in SUMP.
Share the screen, Tom. You have to share the screen.
Sorry. I thought I was already sharing it, Karl-Heinz, but thank you for that. Apologies, audience, for that technical problem. Right, I'm just talking about the session structure here. First of all, saying what monitoring and evaluation is and where it fits into the SUMP process. And then think about targets in SUMPs, why we need them, and different types of targets in SUMPs, and how we might set targets and what sources of information there are to set targets. And then just a few examples of monitoring and evaluation and achieving targets in practice from Edinburgh, Nottingham and York in the UK, and Lutimer in Slovenia, Copenhagen in Denmark, Gdynia, Poland. And then maybe if there's time, a little bit about challenges in monitoring and evaluation. But the first thing that I'd like to do, actually, if it's okay with Karl-Heinz, is just to run a little poll to find out how the audience, how you are in terms of your knowledge and experience in monitoring and evaluation. So Karl-Heinz, I think, do you have to take the screen back?
Yeah, that's right. So I will do that. And share the screen. Wait a second. We want to know what you think about monitoring and evaluation. Okay, everybody participated, great. So most of our don't know yet. Some agree that it's difficult, and nobody says, ah, it's very easy.
Yeah, okay. Hopefully at the end of this seminar, nobody will think it's more complicated than they did at the beginning. Yeah.
So we have another question for you. Well, sorry, here you can see it. Sorry, you don't see the result, I think. And now I go to the next question, which in fact is two questions. It's about monitoring and evaluation in your own SUMP. Do you have enough data for MP? Are you sure what data to gather? Please answer these questions.
we don't have enough data. Yeah, okay, I was kind of expecting these responses. Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that people are often afraid about with monitoring and evaluation is that they don't have enough data and a lot of data is required. And one of the things that I really want to try to get across in this webinar is that maybe you don't necessarily need as much data as you think. And obviously, I'll give you some guidance on what data you can gather for monitoring and evaluation.
Okay.
So,
Two more questions. So this is about also an important aspect. It's about targets. So do you know how to set targets in your SUMP? Do you know the difference between an output target and an outcome target?
yeah, that's great. Okay, right. So that's excellent that people know how to set targets in the SUMP. So I maybe don't have to spend too much time on that, but I can spend more time on the difference between output and outcome targets. Okay.
Okay. I think we continue now, right?
Yeah, let's continue.
Yeah.
So I have to share my screen again, correct, Karl-Heinz?
Exactly. Please, yeah.
Basic definition of monitoring and evaluation. Yeah. Monitoring and evaluation are all part of a cycle. So you could say that the SUMP is a cycle, but monitoring and evaluation help us to set targets within our SUMP scenarios, possibly. Certainly help us to select our measures in order to meet those targets. Then obviously we monitor whether or not targets have been achieved and try to understand through evaluation whether or not, or sorry, why they may or may not have been achieved. So really, monitoring can be summed up as what happened, evaluation summed up as why that thing happened. So the two are different. You can collect data, but it might show you that something has changed, but it won't necessarily tell you why it changed. An appraisal, well, it's related, but I'm not going to cover it much here. What will happen is something worth doing. Why would you monitor, evaluate, and appraise? Well, yeah, gives you basically some direction. So you want to know where you want to go and what you're working for. To know if you're on track is very, very important, because obviously if you're not on track, then you might change what you're doing. So here in this circle, you've got targets. You find out from your monitoring that you're not meeting the targets. So maybe you modify the measures so that they have a better chance of meeting the targets. It can be useful in some circumstances also to compare what you're doing with other places or how well you've done compared with other places. And that includes showing funders that you've achieved what you said you would. And that can, of course, be pretty important in the SUMP situation where maybe national governments or the European Union are providing money for measures in SUMPs. You need to be able to show them, yeah, we achieved what we said we were going to do, because that will help you get more money in the future. And within the SUMP cycle, within the wider Sustainable Mobility Planning cycle in the guidelines, there are various points, but I won't go into them in great detail, at which monitoring and evaluation fits in, and they're highlighted in red here. And actually, there are some videos which I'm not going to show here, but they also can explain to you in more detail how monitoring and evaluation fits in to the wider SUMP planning cycle. And I would say that there are also resources on monitoring and evaluation produced by the earlier Challenge project. So these are guidelines, if you like. Now, they are relatively useful, but what I would maybe caution a little bit is that they can be a little bit complicated and lengthy. Obviously, this Quick Facts is a short publication. It's a summary of this much longer publication. And from my reading of this document, I would say it is particularly suitable for cities who have some experience already of SUMP, maybe are into their second round of SUMP, and who have a lot of resources available for gathering data, because it goes into quite some detail. And that detail, if you're just starting out, or if you're a smaller city, then it might be a little bit overwhelming. So the purpose of my webinar today is just to show, well, maybe there's a slightly simpler way that we can go about this, but still one that's reasonably robust. And what I would say also, as I move on to the basic requirements of monitoring evaluation in SUMPs, if you think about how much monitoring and evaluation is done in transport planning, or has been done in transport planning historically, really very little has traditionally been done. What we've tended to do is to build a project, implement a service, and then move on to the next one, because it's fun to implement stuff. So in your SUMP, even if you propose doing just a little bit of monitoring and evaluation, then you're probably going further than your city has ever done before, certainly in a systematic way. So don't feel too bad, even if you're taking quite a simple, basic approach, especially if it's your first SUMP. Yeah? As you learn more about monitoring and evaluation and have more experience of it, then you can do it in more depth. But you can start simple. It's the KISS principle. Keep it simple, silly, which is not to say that anybody out there is silly. Maybe it should just be KISS with one S. So monitoring and evaluation must relate to your objectives. To me, a fundamental part of the SUMP, I mentioned it in my previous webinar, is the objective, or set of objectives. We're doing this SUMP not just for fun, we're doing it to achieve some things. And one of those things, one of those objectives here, for example, is road safety, right? There are many others. So, improved quality of life, for example, or improved local economy. But here's one: improved road safety. So if your monitoring and evaluation doesn't actually relate to your objectives, then maybe you're wasting your time a little bit. So think, am I gathering data that is relating to one of my objectives, or maybe more than one of my objectives? You should include indicators, so some kind of quantification of a change in relation to your objective. So if you have an objective to improve local air quality, you do need an indicator that will measure in some way the change in local air quality. But that doesn't have to be necessarily an indicator relating to every single pollutant. It really depends on your resources for monitoring and evaluation. We know that most SUMPs seek to reduce the air quality impacts of transport and improve local air quality. Does that mean that for monitoring and evaluation, we have to gather data on particulate PM10s, PM2.5s, nitrogen oxides, polyaromatic hydrocarbons? There are many, many things that you could gather data on. But maybe, especially if you're starting out, and especially if you're a smaller municipality, you might select just one pollutant that you use as your indicator of local air quality, probably the one that's the biggest problem and that's most related to transport. Monitoring and evaluation should relate to some targets. And here's where I introduced the idea of an output target and an outcome target. So in relation to an objective improving local air quality, we can see here a couple of possible targets. The output target: make our local bus fleet 100% compressed natural gas by 2020 is one option. That's a target. That's what you're going to deliver by 2020. Or an outcome target: meeting the European Union target for local air quality in existing hotspots by 2020. So one of those is something that you specifically deliver. It's like something you implement. One of those is something that you actually want to achieve in terms of the overall objective. But I'll come back to why you might choose an outcome and why you might choose an output shortly. what I would say there, very much in the keep it simple line, is not all objectives will necessarily have targets. So when we look at real SUMPs, we find that, you know, there aren't always targets for every objective. And that's up to you, really, to decide. And ideally, monitoring and evaluation should cover process, although I have to say that's done less than maybe it should be. So the process is really taking a step back after a year or after 2 years and saying, well, how did we do? How well did we work? What went well? What didn't go well? What could we do better in future? It's about the planning and implementation process more than what was actually achieved. Although it relates to what was achieved. Clearly, if you have a process that doesn't, you're unlikely to achieve much. So it's worth, often with the help of somebody externally, just taking a bit of time to step back from your SUMP and say, well, what's gone well? What hasn't gone so well? How could we do it better in future? People find that a very useful process if they make time for it. And it doesn't have to be a huge amount of time, you know, a day every 2 years, something like that. And one for Karl Heinz here, plan your monitoring and evaluation in advance so that you aren't just kind of randomly going out and gathering data, but you're thinking, yeah, okay, we have a plan, we know why we're going to gather data, and we know which data we're going to gather. So that's just a diagram that sort of summarizes what I've just said, really. So what about moving on to targets in SUMPs and different types of targets, setting targets? So most of you said that you do have targets in your SUMPs. And I think to an extent I've explained this already, but you know, the objective is what the SUMP should achieve. A typical objective SUMP should reduce local air pollution from transport. How do we know whether our objective is achieved? Well, we can set a target. We can set a target, but what kind of targets are there? So in this, here we can see, right? You could set a target to satisfy legal requirements, and that's very relevant for local air pollution. You know, so trying to satisfy the EU targets for local air pollution. In this case, we say, well, we'll try to keep the annual average PM 2.5 concentrations less than 25 micrograms per meter cubed. All right? So that might be one reason why we set a target. Or maybe we set a target to get different bodies to work together. Because one thing you'll notice from working in SUMP, the things you need to deliver aren't always just dependent on one organization. They can be dependent on a range of organizations. Now, road safety is an interesting one because road safety depends on people who do education. It depends on the police for enforcement. It depends on traffic engineers, transport planners in planning the transport system. It depends on drivers themselves. Yeah. And drivers' organizations. It depends on car manufacturers. So if you can have a target that everybody signs up to, all those organizations, then this can help to focus their mind. So Vision Zero is an example of that, which you can say, well, is it a target? It is kind of a target because it's saying, well, by such and such a date, we will have no deaths on our road network. Or another target that we had in Britain in the early 2000s was to cut killed and seriously injured road casualties by 40% by I think it was 2002 on a 1994 to 1998 base, something like that.
Scurry, I have a question. So if you say objective, you say, okay, it's a general, it's more general, and target is more specific, right?
Well, a target measures the achievement of the objective. So, I mean, in this case, something to aspire to. Yeah. So the target here, our objective may be that we want more people traveling actively, or our objective may be that we want to improve public health through active travel, and then our target related to that is 10% of trips by bike by 2020.
You could also say we want to reduce the number of road injuries by 50% or so. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. So it's quantifying the objective and putting a date on the objective.
Okay.
I mean, I could bring in here the acronym SMART target, but I won't bother. But basically, the target is taking the objective, which might be improved road safety or improved local air pollution, and putting a number on how much change there will be. In this case, the change is 10% of trips by bike.
Yeah.
And it's giving a date to do that. Yeah.
And then it should be something that you can measure. Yeah.
It should obviously be something that you can measure. Yeah. Yeah. So it's pretty problematic if you have targets that you can't measure, which is why, if you remember back in the previous slide, I said not all objectives may have targets. And for example, if your SUMP has an objective to improve the quality of life in a city, it may be very difficult to come up with some adequate measure of, well, what's the quality of life now and how much do we want to improve it? So you may not have a target related to that objective, but you still keep the objective because you think it's something that's worth having, even if you can't exactly measure it. Another reason for having targets is because you can set them in relation to what you think you can achieve. So if you like, it's the opposite of this aspirational target. So the aspirational target is saying, well, this is what you really want to achieve, and we're going to try to work towards it, even if we think it's really difficult. More pragmatically, you can just say, we'll have a target and we'll set it because we know we can achieve that target. And maybe if you want to be super pragmatic, you can have some, well, not super pragmatic, but if you want to take a flexible approach, you can have somewhere between the aspirational target and the what we can achieve target. Two key types of target. Output targets. So an output target is, there's two examples here, one related to active mobility, one related to road safety. So by 2020, we will have installed 30 kilometers of bike lane. Obviously, if you already have 30 kilometers of bike lane, then you're then saying, well, we've installed a further 30 kilometers of bike lane, or we will have traffic calmed 50 kilometers of streets. You might want to be more specific about the nature of the traffic calming. The key issue, or the key point about the output target, is that it's something that the implementing body, usually the city, can itself do and control. So the amount of bike lane that is installed is essentially a product of what the municipality, what the city does, how much money it spends, and where it chooses to spend that money. The same with traffic calming 50 kilometers of street. And the beauty of this is that it's relatively easy for the municipality to control. If it knows how much money it wants to spend on bike lanes or on traffic calming, then it can say, yeah, we can do this much by that date, right? And we will have delivered this output by that date. On the other hand, the outcome target related. So why do you install bike lane? Well, because you want more cyclists. So the outcome target would be cycle mode share will have doubled by 2020, or by 2020 we will have reduced numbers of people killed and seriously injured on our roads by 40% compared to 2010, and that's obviously related to this output target. The question might arise, well, how do we decide whether to have output targets or outcome targets? And that's partly down to judgment, and partly down to how much control you think you might have over the outcome target. So there are other things that will influence whether or not you're going to be able to achieve your cycle mode share target. So for example, the price of petrol. If petrol falls in price, that would probably influence cycle mode share because more people will drive. So the fact that you've installed 30 kilometers of bike lane becomes less relevant. On the other hand, the outcome target is maybe more meaningful because it's what we really want to achieve. Okay, we deliver traffic calm streets because we want improved road safety. Yeah.
But in principle, it's so that you probably first set outcome. We want more cycling, maybe doubling, or we want less injuries. And then you think, okay, what do we have to do to achieve this? And one way could be to make more cycle lanes, but you can also say, okay, we need incentives or whatever.
Yeah.
And you have to decide what you think is most effective, right?
Yeah, what you think is most effective. And also, there's a political element to this. Obviously, because it's less risky in a way to set this kind of, this kind of target, the output target, because you have more control over whether or not that's delivered, then because it's more, if you like, more easily delivered than an outcome target, it's the output target is less politically risky. What we see when we look at some real examples of targets in SUMPs is that there's usually a mixture, yeah, of the output and the outcome. Yeah, I have here one or two typical SUMP objectives and possible targets with some comments. So we quite often within SUMPs would see an objective about improving physical accessibility or accessibility of the transport network for disabled people. That's something we want to achieve often in our cities to have a more socially inclusive society. So an output target could be by 2019, or even as it's now 2019, so let's say by 2020, 100% of pedestrian crossings to be fully accessible to disabled people. Obviously there, the target, how do you know what target is set? Well, it's related to budget, that's one thing. And obviously you have to measure the existing situation. So you need to know how many pedestrian crossings are fully accessible at the moment, so that you know how many you can manage to deliver with the budget that you've got. Or it may be that your politician says, well, we need 100% of pedestrian crossings to be fully accessible by 2020. And therefore, you actually put aside the budget to be able to do that. But you certainly need to measure the existing situation, because otherwise you've no idea how much you've got to achieve. Yeah. And I would hazard a guess that many cities don't actually know what proportion of their pedestrian crossings is fully accessible to disabled people at the moment. So that requires some kind of survey. Another option, outcome. Yeah. This one is the suggestion, by the way, these are just suggestions on my part. Increase the percentage of disabled people who perceive accessibility to be improving by 3% per year. So essentially what we're saying here is that, okay, our objective is to improve accessibility for disabled people. And an outcome is that disabled people feel that it is easier for them to get around. And here, this is just a notional, sort of slightly aspirational target that we hope that our efforts in improving the pedestrian crossings will make them feel that the environment is more accessible. How would you actually gather the data for that? Oops, sorry. Base it on a survey. That's the only way. The only way of getting data about disabled people's perception of accessibility is to carry out some kind of survey. So you can see in this situation that, you know, in terms of the data for your targets, the data you need to show progress towards your targets, then on the left-hand side, it's much easier to get the data for the output target. And this is often the case. Output target data, because you are essentially counting something that you are delivering or implementing, it's easier to get the data for output targets. And that may influence also your choice of output targets versus outcome targets. I'll skip over this one actually, because there's not so much time. Quality of life. Yeah. So I said it might be difficult to measure, but here I've attempted to come up with if your objective is quality of life, what targets might you have? An output target, pedestrianize 4 key city centre streets within 4 years, based on the assumption that a pedestrianised street is somewhere with an improved quality of life, or slowing traffic in city streets, trying to introduce 30 kilometer an hour zones in 50% of city streets within 4 years. Those are output targets again. Or again, some form of perception. The percentage of citizens satisfied with street quality increases by 3% a year. And again, you would need some kind of annual survey to do that. So if you want to measure outcomes, you need perhaps more difficult data than if you've got output targets. Yeah. What about problems in setting targets? Obviously, if you want to set a meaningful target, it's useful to know what the measures that you might implement actually achieve. Because if you set a target, but the measures that you're planning or would consider to implement have no hope of achieving that target, then it's rather silly to set that target. Maybe you should have a less ambitious target, or possibly choose different measures. So to give you an example, an area I'm familiar with, mobility management plans for workplaces. So where big employers do things to try to influence how people travel to work. If those plans do not include some form of parking management, then it's very difficult to reduce the proportion of people driving alone to those workplaces by any more than 10%. Really difficult. So just basing the plan on incentives alone, it won't get you. You'll be very lucky if it'll get you up to a 10% modal shift. So then either you change the target if you've chosen a more stretching target, or you change the measures. So one way of dealing with this problem, if you set output targets, then you're less of a hostage to what can be achieved by a measure, because output targets are simply basically setting a target for the number of measures that will be implemented. Set an ambitious target. So our national cycling strategy in Scotland has that 10% of trips by bike by 2020, up from the current 1% in 2019. So that's a pretty ambitious target. Karl-Heinz likes that one. Look at what measures achieved elsewhere. So in my measure selection webinar a few weeks ago, I explained in particular, so I won't go again, but the Consult database from Leeds University is a very good source of information about what measures can achieve. How much modal shift can you expect? How much traffic reduction? How much road safety improvement can you expect from a given measure? And that helps you to set a target.
Yeah, maybe we take a little
break.
Take a break if there are some questions.
Yeah.
I just saw one small question for a slide. There was a previous slide. There was Greg McDonald suggested that maybe this sample of 100 people would be too small. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. It's a small sample, right? So in terms of statistical reliability, it's not very good, I admit. But if you do it every year, then you can at least track changes over time, right? And that helps you to see whether you're achieving your target, whether there's a change, whether there's a change in a positive direction or whether there's a change in a negative direction. If you have more resources, obviously you would do a bigger survey where the confidence intervals in the results are much smaller, so you can put more trust in the results for a given year. But by repeating even a small survey over a number of years, then you see a trend, which is what you're really looking for. And yeah, it's a resource issue. So if you're a small city, you might go for a small survey. If you're a big city, you go for a bigger survey. But that's one of the challenges of monitoring and evaluation, if you like. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. I don't see any more questions at the moment, but I think just continue.
What about if you don't have data? Yeah. You can set simple targets, simple output targets. Don't have many targets. Mix the output and outcome targets, and use simple data gathering. So this comes back to the question from Greg, small sample sizes in surveys. Not methodologically massively rigorous, but in a small city with limited resources, they're a good option for seeing what the trend is over time. Roadside counts of traffic. So roadside, standing somebody at the side of the road. I mean, obviously now there are other ways of gathering data through, for example, mobile phone data. But you have to pay for that mobile phone data. So again, it might not be possible for you as a city to afford that. So you might have to fall back on manual surveys. So roadside counts can help you to understand roughly how many people are coming into the city centre by car, how many people are coming by bus, by bike and on foot. And again, it's not hugely accurate, but it can help you to establish a trend over time to see whether your modal share is going in a more positive direction or a more negative direction. So those are, I mean, if you have a lot of money and a lot of time to analyze the data, then of course you can use more rigorous methods of data gathering. But particularly for those cities starting out with SUMP, you don't have much money and aren't very large cities, then I would strongly advocate simple methods of data gathering, at least to begin with. Because what we basically want to do is to try to establish whether or not the trend of what is happening in your transport system is going in the right direction in relation to your objectives. And you can do that with these smaller surveys. Later, if you get more resources and more experience, then you can introduce more accurate ways of data gathering. Targets and indicators in real life SUMPs, what's been happening. In my own city, these are the objectives of the SUMP: improve the local economy, improve safety for road and transport users, improve environmental impacts of travel, health and fitness, and reducing social exclusion, making sure that people can participate in society. So I won't go through every part of this table, but essentially, if you can go back yourself if you wish, if you're interested, but I'll give a couple of examples. Right? So support a sustainable and growing local and regional economy. That's the objective, the economic growth objective. In this case, no target for that. No target to say how much the economy should grow or how much congestion should reduce as a result of the SUMP. No target because the target is maybe too politically difficult, and also the economy depends on so many things other than transport. But there are indicators, so data gathered on just traffic volumes from traffic counters the city already has, and connectivity by rail and air to other cities. That's one option, or one example. So those are, well, traffic volumes is effectively an outcome indicator. Connectivity is more of an output indicator. Reduce the environmental impacts of travel down here. The target is to meet the EU standard, but the indicator is emission standards for the bus and taxi fleet. So the indicator is actually what is happening in the vehicle fleet. So I won't go through every one of those, as I said, but how to gather the data, right? So how would you measure congestion? Well, in this case, key junctions in a city have traffic counters, which can measure queues. So that's a way of measuring congestion. Traffic counters can measure traffic volumes. If you want to know what's happening to bus and taxi emission standards, data from the bus company about the emissions characteristics of their buses, and taxi licensing data, because the local authority, the city, has to license taxis, will give you that information. Yeah. So you can see here, actually, if you look down this list of the indicators, then the measurement of the indicators is quite simple and also relies as much as possible on existing data. the one perhaps, the one variation to that, the National Household Survey for mode shift. So the indicator is the mode share for trips. The National Household Survey, the City Council boosts the sample in the city, or is boosted by the city. So the city pays for a larger sample in the city in order to get a more reliable result. Targets in Luton are a very municipality of about, I think it's 7,000 people. Oh, sorry. And you can see here some that are very relevant to other small cities in many parts of Europe. So cutting out migration, making sure that the city attracts people to live there, and a balanced modal split, balance being between car and active travel and public transport, a road safety related target, and some specific mode share targets about public transport and cycling to work. Yeah. And the data gathered is from very small scale surveys. Yeah, Gdynia in Poland, I just wanted to show you an example of where I think maybe a city has decided to try to gather too much data for monitoring and evaluation. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through this table in any detail. You'll be pleased to hear Karl-Heinz and hopefully other participants as well. All I'm saying is this is actually only a quarter of the indicators that are proposed to be gathered in the Gdynia SUMP, which was published in 2015. So there's a 2015 value for most of the indicators and a target for 2018. And I would say for an initial SUMP, this is a lot of data to gather. And also, it may be that there are some objectives that nonetheless don't have an indicator, and some objectives that have a very large number of indicators, and they've all got targets. So I think this is, I can understand why Gdynia did this. It's good to have the comfort of data, or one feels comfortable with more data. But actually, this is probably too much data. And because there's so much data, it will actually be hard to show progress towards objectives, because some indicators related to one objective might move in one direction and some in another. So, especially in an initial SUMP, I think it's important that one doesn't feel that one has to have, in this case, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 40 indicators. I would strongly suggest that that's quite, well, that's just too much or too many. Another issue, I think in Ljubljana, I mean, this is a case of setting aspirational targets, but these targets are very, very aspirational to the extent where they may be unachievable, and that's a political risk. Yeah, so we can see there, 2011 target, situation, 67% of trips by car, 2015, 55% of trips by car, 2020, 34% of trips by car. Now, Consult would show you this, but really I'm not aware of any city that's managed to reduce its car mode share from 55% to 34% in a 5-year period. Yeah? That's a very, very tough target. So it's not to say that this part of the pie chart shouldn't get smaller compared to 2015, but maybe not that small, unless the city was prepared to contemplate very, very significant restrictions on car traffic, but most cities are not. So beware perhaps of setting overly aspirational targets. It's good to have stretching targets, but overly aspirational targets can be politically risky too. And then finally in Nottingham, in England, these are just some real targets. So the objectives: cut congestion, improve accessibility, improve the local economy, improve the quality of life. But the targets are very, very simple. This is from the 2006 to 11 SUMP. So the congestion measurement is only related to has a target related only to bus routes and the journey times on bus routes, and that's simply measured by bus timetables. So the idea is that if congestion reduction is achieved, the bus company should be able to reschedule its bus routes to achieve a journey time reduction of 5 minutes. So very basic. Quality of life. Again, they chose a target that's related to public transport use. There's high public transport use in Nottingham because it's quite a poor city. But this is 67% of people using the bus at night feel safe. And this is just based on a 600 bus passenger survey each year. So you can see there that in their SUMP of 2006 to 11, there's very basic targets set. Just to say, by the way, also, you might ask, did they achieve their targets? And I'm afraid we don't know, because their requirement to monitor and evaluate was placed on them in 2006 by national government, but taken away in 2008, so they stopped gathering the data. And I won't go into this one because I think we've got enough examples now. Monitoring and evaluation challenges. There's just a list on a table, which is probably too much to go through now. So in conclusion, don't get too stressed by monitoring and evaluation. Keep it simple, especially in a first SUMP and especially in a smaller city. Don't have too many targets. Don't worry if they're not based on completely robust data. Sometimes it's impossible to gather totally robust data. And data gathering doesn't have to be as complicated as you might think. I'm a big advocate of keeping it simple, especially at the beginning, because even if you keep it simple, you'll still be doing more monitoring and evaluation than you did before. Do we have time for a very quick survey, Karl-Heinz, just to wrap things up?
Yes, we should manage. We still have 9 minutes left.
Okay.
So I try to do this. Can you see the survey, Tom?
I can. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Then let's see. We would like to ask you now about how you will do in your SUMP. Will you make sure that it's simple? How many indicators you think you will have? Please start voting.
Let's have a look. Well, hopefully people aren't giving just the answer that they think I want them to say. So that's comforting to know that people will now try to take a more simple approach.
Yeah, there are still some buts or disagree a bit. Yeah. So if you have a question, then please ask it. Yeah, by the chat line.
I mean, yeah, it may be that the person who disagrees, they think, well, you know, we've gone beyond that stage, and it could well be that, you know, if you're from a municipality that has a lot of experience in SUMP, then of course this, you know, what I've outlined is too simple for you, and that's okay. But my concern is that many municipalities, many cities starting out, they're a little bit put off by some publications that seem to suggest that they have to gather lots and lots and lots of data. Okay.
Well, one more question. This was the one that we asked already in the beginning, but let's see. Maybe we have some improvement. Difference between an output target and an outcome target.
I hope yes. Oh,
looks quite good. Yeah.
Yeah. Learning outcome achieved.
Good. Build more buses or get less pollution is a difference. Okay, great. Yeah, if you have any other questions, please ask them in the chat.
What is the okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I answer the message? What is the share of budget you would suggest within a complete SUMP process for monitoring and evaluation? maybe somewhere between 3 and 5% max. What's that chat message? Would I suggest public surveys to establish modal split? Can you share? Can I share a household survey? I didn't see the full chat there from Greg.
Well, what I see is, would you suggest public surveys to establish modal split? Yeah, that's the question.
If it's your...
What is meant by public surveys?
Yeah, well, a survey of, asking people their travel habits. Increasingly, there are more sophisticated methods of doing it through the use of apps, for example, with a sample population. But if you don't have access to those apps, if you don't have access to mobile phone data, and mobile phone data doesn't show you why people are traveling, which is always a useful bit of information to have, then yeah, public survey, even a small public survey, is a good idea. I mentioned the cordon count, where you basically stand around the main entrances to your city centre for a day and count the number of people travelling in and out by different modes. It gives you a mode share for the city centre. Not a very accurate one, but if you do it at the same time and in the similar weather, the following year you start to establish a trend, which is again what you want to see. Are we moving our modal split in the right direction or the wrong direction? So yeah, still some form of survey is probably the best way of trying to establish modal share.
So there's a question from Robert. Would you as city publish the objectives?
Yes.
And even more the targets to the public?
Normally, yes. Yep. But that's why it's political, right? So why you need to involve your politicians in the setting of targets, and why sometimes you might have more output than outcome targets.
Okay, then the question from Nazan is, would you recommend establishing a citizens panel for monitoring and evaluation? So what is meant by a citizens panel?
Citizens panel is a group of people who undertake to fill in a survey, to be regularly surveyed about what's happening in their city. I think, yeah, that can be very useful because you have a group of people there who are committed to answering regular surveys, and for things like quality of life, for example, those kinds of panels can be very useful. The thing to do is, of course, make sure that they're reasonably representative, and again, it's a resource issue because you need some resources to manage the citizens panel. The citizens panel, should they be paid for their efforts? No, not normally. Okay, and I think unfortunately I have to go now because I have another meeting.
Okay, well, we're at the end of the time anyway.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, everybody who participated. Thank you, Tom. We
Pleasure.
will publish the results. We will send you the presentation, and we will send you edited recording or the link to it. And yeah, so this was the last official prosperity seminar. Maybe we will do some others, we don't know yet, and maybe we will also link it to others, to other projects. Okay, so
cheers for now. Thanks a lot, Karl-Heinz, for facilitating.
Sure.
Bye.
You're welcome. Bye everybody.